Hello, it is I, Dr. Campbell Price, Curator of Egypt and Sudan, here at Manchester Museum, about to give you a tour of golden mummies of Egypt. It's been seen already by over 300,000 people, but I would like you to join me as we look at some of the highlights. Even if you've been to the exhibition before, or you're planning to come, I hope that by getting a curator's eye view of some of the pieces inside, that you'll be intrigued to come again or to make your first visit. The exhibition is not just about ancient Egypt in general. It's not about pyramids. It's not necessarily even about pharaohs. It's about Egypt in the Greco-Roman period. So that's Egypt in the last 3 centuries BC and the first couple of centuries AD, when Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies and Egypt was ruled by the Roman emperors. Egypt was never as isolated as people often tend to assume. Egypt was in contact and remained in contact with other cultures in Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean, sometimes through trade, sometimes through warfare. So the first couple of objects we have in the exhibition illustrate the reliance for several centuries of the Egyptian state on Greek mercenaries. This is a Corinthian helmet from Greece from maybe 600 BC. And this rather nice pointy helmet, possibly belonging to an Assyrian soldier connected to the sack of Thebes in the 8th century BC. So all of this illustrates Egypt being in contact with other cultures, which really is the theme of the show. Coming into the main exhibition space here, I like to begin an exhibition tour by considering objects which are from a domestic context. So these are the kinds of things people might have had in their houses. Now these illustrate a range of gods and goddesses, and they show images of gods with a more kind of classical appearance that look more like Greek or Roman gods, but which mix in elements of Egyptian iconography or the identity of Egyptian deities. So my favorite piece here is the god Bes, the great protector of the home, particularly of vulnerable people. And whereas usually he's shown as a naked dwarf with feathers and a protruding tongue, here he's got the feathers and the protruding tongue, but he's dressed in Macedonian armor. So the scariest thing the Egyptians could think of in the Ptolemaic period was someone dashing about with Macedonian armor trying to beat them up. So this is typically this pharaonic idea of something threatening, something dangerous, turned on itself and recalibrated in the service of defense. So something scary, something threatening, turned against your enemies to help protect you. So these are the kinds of objects someone perhaps would encounter in a house, in a home, where the family would be gathered. But if you were wealthy enough, you could prepare for the afterlife, the very expensive afterlife, by being mummified. Now this really is one of the most distinctive cultural products from Egypt, the production of a mummified body. And so this is the first of 8 mummified people that are featured in the exhibition. It shows a man called Artemidoris. His name is given in Greek on his chest, and he is a multicultural man. His name is given in Greek. His portrait shows him as an elite Roman individual. Whether he was or not is not clear. He's got his golden laurel leaves on his portrait. And surrounding the body, enveloping the body, are these images of pharaonic gods. So you have the god Osiris in the middle, a winged goddess. You have these crowned falcon birds, birds of prey. But you also have the starburst signs, often associated with the Macedonian royal family. Of course, it was Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon, who kicked off the Greco-Roman period in Egypt with his invasion liberation of Egypt in the 300s BC. So altogether, this marks a multicultural expectation of the afterlife and highlights something that really is a theme throughout the whole show, and that is the dead becoming gods. So we do not have in this show CT scans. CT scans have been taken of all the mummified mummified remains in the exhibition, but we deliberately decided not to include them to focus instead in this show on what's on the outside, the expectations for the transformative power of mummification to take the body, which would otherwise, of course, decompose, and turn it into something permanent, something divine, an effigy for all time. One of my favourite pieces that's really nothing to do with mummification is, in this case, just behind Artemidoris. Quite unassuming, unless you know what it is. It's a glass lens there on the left. It is convex, but it's made of man-made glass, entirely clear, about 2,000 years old. And the excavator Flinders Petrie, when he found it at the site of Hawara, a very important Greco-Roman cemetery site from which most of the material in the exhibition comes, when he found that glass lens, he assumed it was used as a way of focusing light, perhaps to start a fire, or something of the function of a bullseye, as he called it. You can actually, though, use the lens as a magnifying glass. And so we have here text written on papyrus. This is the waste paper of the time, found in huge quantities at the important Greco-Roman site of Oxyrhynchus. So we have, memos on state visits by the Roman emperor. We have receipts for taxes which had to be paid, and even a sale document concerning a young girl who's been traded from the area of modern Syria to Egypt and further on the Roman Empire. Complexities, difficulties, realities of society in Greco-Roman Egypt. Moving on, we build up the idea that preparations for the afterlife had to involve a kind of armor. You needed to prepare the body in a certain way and decorate it in a certain way to associate with the deceased with the gods they were going to become one with. So here, some chest plates from the mummified remains of individuals buried at the Fayum sites of Hawara and Lahoun. Very distinctive. Once you get to know the imagery of certain sites, certain time periods, you start to recognize that same imagery in different objects. And then a piece that is not from Hawara, but from the site of Antinopolis or Antinoe, a city in southern Middle Egypt associated with Antinous, the lover of the Emperor Hadrian. Here is a shroud of a young girl. She has her hand open, palm facing outwards, and she's shown as a transformed divine being, because at the top, although it's damaged, at the very top of the shroud, we can see a frieze of rearing uraei, cobras, that mark the presence of a divinity. They're often found in shrines or places you would put the image of a god, like a cultic cupboard, you would put an image of a god. This is a very important marker of the fact that this person has undergone that transformation and has become one with divine beings in the hereafter. Really, Golden Mummies of Egypt is an exhibition about faces. We are constantly intrigued by faces. People come into the exhibition and they think they recognize people, or they speculate on what people might have looked like. None of these faces represent people as they actually were. They represent idealized, perfected, divinized faces, and often they were made in series from molds in large numbers. So even though the privilege of mummification was really one enjoyed only by the rich, it was still an industry over time, and to help the production of objects in that funerary industry, mass production was a key component. That didn't mean the deceased was any less divine. In fact, the face of the deceased was hieroglyphic. It doesn't represent them as they actually were, is a marker that, in fact, the deceased had joined and had become one of the gods or the goddesses. The identity of which god one would become has been the subject of much speculation. So here we have an image, a very important image, of the goddess Isis with a sun disk on her head, supporting, kind of encouraging back to life her husband, Osiris. So Osiris is shown here, actually rather diminutive compared to the figure of his wife Isis, but with his tall crown and with hieroglyphs above his head, identifying him as Osiris. For much of pharaonic history, so for thousands of years up to the Greco-Roman period, it was assumed everyone, men and women, would become Osiris in the afterlife, that they would join with Osiris, and they would become this generic ideal, this divine ideal. As we'll see later on, those ideas slightly shift in Greco-Roman times, because preparation for the afterlife involved letting go of individuality. It wasn't important what you really looked like. It wasn't really important how you lived your life to an extent, because all of that would be subsumed in a divine identity. So here, for example, is the mummy cover of a young girl. There are no human remains under the cover, but she is shown as an adult woman with the garb of a divine being. Elaborate hairdo, lots of flowers in her hair, jewelry on her hands, arms, and in earring form, as an adult woman would have. So often, unlucky individuals who died as children are shown as full adults, as mature adults, just in miniature form, because you don't want to exist necessarily in the afterlife as a child. The expectation of divinity, then, is made most clear in these two mummified people. This gilded mask belongs to a lady called Isaius, the daughter of Demetrios. Her name is given in Greek at the top of the mask. And then her overall appearance owes much to fashions among fashionable Greco-Roman ladies of the time in about the 2nd century AD. But she is also provided with a really well-preserved set of images of pharaonic gods and goddesses and images of appropriate things for the afterlife, the transformation from the organic remains of a human body into the permanent divine effigy of a god. So ancient Egyptian texts are very clear on this point, that gods have bones of iron or silver, hair of lapis lazuli, and flesh, skin made of gold. So that is why, if you could afford it, your plaster mask would be covered in gold leaf. Here, however, we can see a scene in which the mummy lies on a bed, a lion-headed bed. It's attended by the god Anubis, shown there offering a libation or incense. And under the bed, there are 4 canopic jars. Now, this is something that everyone associates with ancient Egypt, but was only in fashion up to a point. And by Greco-Roman times, certainly by Roman times when Isaias lived and died, there simply were no canopic jars. This is a fiction, because it gives the lie to the fact that none of these images are snapshots of reality. They are prospective, they are magical, they are what is appropriate, what is decorous, to enable the deceased to transform into a god. This is simply part of the process that would be visualized to allow the deceased to become a god. It's not necessarily something that was done. So these gilded ladies both come from the site of Hawara, a very important site in Egypt. It was the site of the excavations led by Flinders Petrie, conducted by many hundreds of Egyptian men, women, and children, which, although Petrie went, he says explicitly, in search of information about the Middle Kingdom and the pyramid of King Amenemhat III, what he ended up finding was a huge Greco-Roman period cemetery. In that cemetery, he uncovered, or his workers uncovered, thousands of bodies, of which only 2 or 3% contained any kind of decorative material. So what you're seeing here is a small part of a much bigger component of wealthy society, because mummification, even without elaborate decorative trappings, would be expensive, and for most people, I guess, would be unattainable. The preparations for the afterlife did not necessarily just include masks covered in gold, but they included a different way of visualizing the deceased as a god. This is something that many visitors will be surprised by, because it's not necessarily a form of image making that we associate with the ancient Egyptians, and that is the so-called Fayum portraits. So these are very thin wooden panels with incredibly striking human faces painted on them. Again, this is a mixed, multicultural expectation of the afterlife. It's not possible, as Flinders Petrie perhaps tried to do, to categorize these people as either Greek, Roman, or Egyptian. They have mixed identities. So here, for example, the man is shown in a flat wooden portrait, very striking face, but he is provided with the same helmet-like mask showing him with golden skin, as we have seen elsewhere in the exhibition, and he is positively hedged by divinities. He has traditional Egyptian gods captioned with short hieroglyphic texts surrounding and enveloping his head, and the shroud that covers his body, this red-coloured shroud, has a whole series of Egyptian deities shown upon it. This is evidence of multiple expectations of the afterlife. It's not simply one simple path to go through to achieve immortality. There are different ways, different combinations of imagery which are going to achieve the ultimate aim, which was to integrate this man in the world of the gods. Most intriguingly here, as on some of the other mummified bodies we know from the Greco-Roman period, the feet, which were once encased in a sort of foot case, are quite badly damaged, because many of these Roman period mummies at Hawara and perhaps at other sites were made to be stood up. They were made to be displayed for some unknown time in a kind of cultic context where they could be visited. So unlike in pharaonic times, when after the funeral the body was put out of sight and was buried securely, here in Greco-Roman times, especially at Roman period Hawara, we do have the sense that there was an expectation of interaction between the living and the mummified body of the deceased. In the imagery of these people, very striking images, one of the best collections of these kinds of material outside Cairo, you really just get the idea of idealism. A lot of people want these, are seduced by these faces. We want the people who look like this, as if this was some kind of Polaroid snapshot. It's not. This is, at best, an idealizing image of the deceased. They are images possibly that were bought by the family from a selection and which were integrated into the mummified body for the funeral. In this case, CT scan data interpreted by colleagues has shown that this gentleman was significantly overweight. That is shown by the folds of skin still preserved on the body. He was tightly wrapped, of course, to contain him in these wrappings after being dehydrated through the process of mummification. But it just raises the question about what you see in the portrait actually matching the reality about what someone actually looked like. This gentleman has these golden laurels again in his hair. He has a little bit of gold between his lips even. And the best way of dating one of these portraits is by the hairstyle. And the hairstyle follows the hairstyle of the Roman emperor at the time. Remember, please, that the Roman emperor was considered to be a god. He certainly was a god as the Pharaoh of Egypt. So this is simply a different way of representing, of visualizing the divine nature of the deceased who's gone through the transformative process of mummification. And so all of these portraits from the 1st and 2nd century AD represent the deceased in an idealized fashion. I don't think necessarily anyone looked exactly like this. These are not photographic reproductions as we might expect them to be today. And so, concluding, in the final section of the exhibition, we consider the variations maybe on those images of the deceased from Hawara, because these mummy covers, the mummy cover of a lady here, is not from Hawara, it's from the site of the Karga oasis in the western desert in Egypt. So this is a deceased woman shown as the goddess Hathor. So Hathor is known for several thousands of years before the Greco-Roman period. She's known as the Golden One. She is the mistress of drunkenness and dancing and partying, but she's also the one who welcomes the deceased into the West, into the afterlife. So with her elaborate tresses of hair, her jewelry, her makeup, she is the kind of party cow. She's often visualized as a cow or a cow-headed woman in pharaonic iconography. This is an interesting departure in terms of concepts of what happens to the female dead after death. And the same concept is articulated here in fact, the oldest mummified body on display. This is probably early Ptolemaic in date, this coffin, and the occupant is a lady called Ta Sheri Ankh. Now, her name is given in hieroglyphs on the side, but those hieroglyphs also describe her as not the Osiris, as had been the case for centuries previously, but as the Hathor. So she'd literally become the goddess Hathor. And this is typical from the last couple of centuries BC, that female deceased people kind of coalesce and magically transform into the goddess Hathor, whereas men remain identified with the god Osiris. This final section also considers the reception of these incredibly striking images of the dead from Greco-Roman Egypt, because this lady is known to have been in a private collection belonging to a man called George Eliot, an MP for Monmouthshire in the 1880s. George Eliot was also friends with an Irish writer called Bram Stoker. Now, Bram Stoker is, of course, known for the novel Dracula, but he also wrote a hair-raising Egyptian tale, The Jewel of Seven Stars, which I could quite imagine was inspired by the body and coffin of Ta Sheri Ankh, because it talks of it tells the story of a time-traveling ancient Egyptian queen called Tera who comes back to Edwardian England, and who knows, I like to think myself that Bram Stoker was inspired by seeing this golden divine face on the coffin in the possession of his friend. And it reminds us also that those Fayum portraits that we've just seen around the corner are known to have been put on display in a temporary show in London in the 1880s by Flinders Petrie. And it was there's good circumstantial evidence that show was seen by Oscar Wilde. So the picture of Dorian Gray, which appeared a couple of years later, very likely, of course, to be inspired by one of those handsome young men in the portraits. So all of this shows, and is perhaps a reason why So many people have come to the exhibition, over 300,000 people in Manchester alone in less than 3 months since we've reopened. And I think the attraction of the golden mummies of Egypt is they allow us to put a face on the past, they allow a personal connection, but they have the intrigue of the gold, the art, the sex, the death, that has intrigued archaeologists and visitors to Egypt for centuries. And hopefully the exhibition gives maybe a slightly unexpected take on mummification as a process of transformation than simply a process of preservation. And I hope if you've not seen it, you will be able to come and visit us here in Manchester Museum sometime soon.